theoretical grounding, titled Daddies as well, several dimensions of oppression, justice in this relatively short talk, hopefully. Right, so first, like a note on terminology that makes it sound a bit fancier than it is, but to explain a bit more what I mean when I say daddy, this is kind of like a shorthand for what Simone de Beauvoir refers to as man in general, which is essentially what it means to be a man defined in sort of patriarchal terms. So the idea that there is something about male masculinity that makes men special or superior, or maybe even a little magic. And also another reason for using the word daddy to describe this is because it kind of comes from Beauvoir's rearticulation or maybe correction of Freud, where she notes that it makes sense that Freud would have something to say, or that we would have in general want to say something about people's relationship to their fathers and how it makes them view the world. But the important thing to note is that it's not significant because of people having a special relationship to their dads. It's significant because people's fathers are, generally speaking, men, and like having a man as one of your first role models is quite significant, and also shapes your idea about what it means to be a man and sort of general ideas about manhood, and makes you buy into this idea of kind of men being a bit like demigods, because it's kind of inevitable that children view their parents a little bit like demigods and special, because, you know, they have access to all kinds of things that you don't, whether that is information or ice cream or candy or whatever. And so they seem like they have all these powers and they can, you know, move through the world in a way that you can't. But then you grow up and you realize your parents are just people. But the problem that Beauvoir notes is that people sometimes grow up and they maybe realize that their own father is not a demigod, but they think that other men might be. More on that later. I also want to note that I'm talking about male masculinity because I want to specify that masculinity is sort of in general a gender neutral term, but what I'm talking about here is specifically male masculinity, and because I do think that this specific kind of masculinity we're going to talk about is something that really is only possible for men to embody. Again, not because masculinity is something that is exclusive to men, but this particular kind. And so, say a little bit more about the term daddy. So I want to first just say that that is something that, like, it's not something that you can take on as an individual. It's something that kind of has to be placed upon you by others. Like, it's a way that people view you, not a way that you kind of necessarily can come to view yourself without first other people understanding you in this way. That being said, obviously, if you help perpetuate that image of yourself or get caught up in the idea that you need to live up to it, that you are special in this kind of way, that, you know, you kind of have the special skills of like a father figure, that you can tell people what to do, and that you know your way around the world, and you can guide other people, and you want to do that in this very particular way. By all means, that helps perpetuate the myth, but it is ultimately something that requires sort of outside participation, as it were. And to borrow some more from Beauvoir, she talks about why she thinks people are so prone to doing this. She talks about specifically women, but I think it's something that happens to people. It's something that people of all genders do. And this is the idea that you would rather be ruled by a god than a tyrant, because in realizing that there is something about male power in society, that they have more of it, and more of it than perhaps you even if you haven't got like a feminist sensibility, you might still have like an intuition that's more than they should. Reconceptualizing that as less of someone being a tyrant and more of someone being a god can be a kind of coping mechanism, but it's ultimately a destructive coping mechanism, because of course no man is actually a god, and it helps like perpetuate the superior status of men if we buy into this idea that they are actually special, sometimes just because they embody a certain kind of masculinity. And so it creates this kind of fork in the road where you can get stuck in this like perpetual cycle where you kind of make the same mistake over and over and over again. That instead of like realizing that, you know, a particular man is not, you know, does not fit the criteria for being a daddy because, you know, he's actually just a person and he's not special and he's not magical. In realizing that, one would hope that you'd realize that it's actually the whole concept is kind of a sham, it's a myth. But what a lot of people do instead is they kind of just go out looking for a better candidate. You know, if you know, the example Beauvoir uses is that, you know, a lot of women realize that their actual fathers are not special. It turns out they're not, you know, these demigods. But instead of recognizing that that is because they've been sold a lie about male masculinity, they, you know, want to hold on to that like promise that there is someone special out there, because it feels good to to believe that there is someone out there who can, you know, tell you what to do and always has all the answers in part, and like that is the promise you're given. And so instead of recognizing it's a myth, they perpetuate the cycle and just keep looking for a new candidate every time. It inevitably fails because, you know, you may have a dad, but you'll never have a daddy because they're not, these special men don't actually exist because they're just people. And I think this relates to kind of how we tend to think about heroes. And I think in particular, how we kind of think about something like a hero, or maybe just a leader, but like a leader that has a kind of, has the kind of like aura of being a hero, where like, because like we kind of pick up on or are socialized to think about, you know, a way to get legitimacy is to show that what Adrienne Marie Brown refers to as like a charismatic leader is on your side. You can kind of borrow from the authority, as it were, for your movement from having this like charismatic person who kind of fulfills this like image of the hero. And I think one thing to know is like that is, we cannot like pick apart authority from our ideas about masculinity, because so much of what we consider to be a legitimate, or what gives you a legitimate claim to authority, has to do with masculinity. Like everything from like the pitch of your voice to the way you stand, how tall you are, all these things. And another thing is that like when we do this, like very often like it becomes a kind of competition, right? Like sometimes that is framed, you know, in terms of historical figures, you know, which historical figure who was in some kind of feud 100 years ago, like which side are you on, as if that is particularly significant. Or sometimes, you know, when picking leaders for political organizations and stuff like that, it becomes this kind of personality contest instead of being about, you know, actually what's best for the organization. Is like, who do you like most? And very often like men who embody this certain kind of masculinity, who can, I suppose, be the organization's daddy, if you will, becomes the one who like is most likely to win that kind of leadership competition, or the one who kind of is more like convincing to people as, oh well, this man embodies a kind of masculinity that kind of I recognize as being more desirable, and so he was probably right. It's a thing that people do all the time, even people who are supposedly radical, because it's like, if you don't catch yourself doing it, it's so easy to just kind of like just assume that what you've been taught about masculinity and what it means or what it doesn't mean, just assume that is correct, and then use that to make judgment calls about who to trust and who to think about as authorities in a way that is not very helpful. And I think even though we might not think about it in terms of like domination in our like everyday lives, I do think that like that there is something about like domination like that comes up is, and then there's this idea that, you know, a true leader can kind of bring everyone in line and get everyone on board with the same stuff by kind of, you know, having this kind of dominating will or drive, or even just kind of, sometimes it's just phrased in terms of enthusiasm, which is, I think in particular when it comes to like the gender dimensions here, and also can be is quite commonly also about, I think, to know about whiteness, is that people who are not actually from the oppressed groups can have this like enthusiasm and this vision of themselves as kind of a hero who's going to come in and help, you know, really like put a stop to certain kinds of oppression, and have all these ideas that kind of in turn makes them just kind of disregard and kind of override what actual like marginalized people, oppressed people are trying to do for themselves and kind of try and like take over because they think they've got a better idea, or they get, you know, their particular conception of what it would look like for them to use their privilege for good, becomes this kind of, you know, domination through enthusiasm kind of thing. And again, like the idea of like the charismatic leader as someone who brings legitimacy to a movement, right? I mean, this is very apparent with political parties, right? Because the political leader often is the one who gets to be the face of the party, gets to participate in debate and stuff like that. And so if you've got, you know, the charismatic leader, like a man in particular, who gets, you know, kind of has this like, almost like just has this daddy appeal, like you get that kind of brings you some legitimacy that makes people listen. And we notice this, and we kind of, because of that, it's something that becomes desired, even within radical spaces, because we understand that that, you know, people will listen to a man like that more than anybody else. But I do think that it is important to resist that. Now, I think it's interesting to think of it kind of as like a gift and a curse, because there is something to, you know, as much as charisma, I think, is a bit overrated, it also does have its uses. And obviously someone who can like has a certain kind of presence and is good at making people listen, like that can be, you know, as I put here, like a gift. But the key is to figure out how to actually use it and not rely on it to just create this like hero figure for the party, because, you know, as soon as they're gone, things have a tendency to collapse. If you build your movement around one person, they inevitably will fail or die or whatever, and then you don't have them anymore and everything tends to collapse. And so I don't think that, even though like it can be tempting, it's not actually a sustainable way to do political work. And so what to think about instead is to think about, you know, what does it actually mean to be a leader? Because sometimes it's okay to have leaders, right? And like a very trivial example would be something like if somebody knows where the bus stop is and you don't, having them lead you there is not, you know, that is obviously fine. But it requires, I think it's important to keep in mind that leadership requires like certain kinds of skills or knowledge. And I think it's also important to think about it as a service, right? Like if somebody's leading you in a discussion, say, that facilitation is a kind of service to the general community to make the discussion flow better. And a little note here is that like I often find that people try and bring almost like the ghost of some like dead hero figure from the left back to try and do the same thing of like using like their particular kind of masculine image to kind of lend some credence to their own ideas, right? Like this, you know, man who we all agree was a great hero and did all these amazing things would agree with me kind of approach, right? And now noting what I said about leadership and how it's something that requires certain skills and knowledge and kind of it needs to be acted out as a kind of service, that obviously cannot be provided by a dead man, just by definition. And so I, you know, in thinking about that, it struck me as it's something that is comes up in The Haunting of Hill House, the Netflix show, this idea that a ghost is a wish. And I sometimes feel like the way that people talk about like these certain dead men is kind of like that. They bring back their ghosts as a kind of wish because they recognize that there are no, you know, men currently alive who can fulfill that role truly, right? Especially if you have a kind of feminist sensibility and you're critical of especially like male leaders, you will notice that they don't live up to the sort of like daddy stereotype. They you know, they inevitably fail. They show themselves to not have like unlearned certain forms of misogyny or sexism or homophobia or transphobia. But dead men don't do that. Dead men, you know, have made all the mistakes that they're going to make. So especially if you kind of disregard all the things that you think are less important, or, you know, make some sort of decision about what you're going to care about and not care about in terms of their legacy, you know, they're kind of a wish, I think, for an actual, like someone who can actually be that kind of hero or that kind of daddy, in the sense that, you know, they can't make the mistakes anymore. They're kind of yours to do with as you will. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that, you know, these people are just people, right? So it's important not to glorify them, not in real life, and also importantly, not in death. Then I think, you know, there's a move some people make here where they notice that, well, we glorify all these men, and we have this idea that masculinity is what gives authority, and like all like that, you know, who should lead us have to have these masculine qualities. And they do a kind of like a radical girl boss move, or like I guess, you know, instead of a daddy, want a mummy, if you. And I do think that's a mistake. I want to like first just bring up sort of a sympathetic note. That I see some like people who are just more strictly involved in feminist organizing bring up sometimes. It's a kind of frustration when, you know, you point out, say that like, oh, you know, look at how few women there are at this like incredibly important, you know, political meeting, like how few political leaders are women. And, you know, someone like comes along and it's like, well, should you want women to be the ones dropping bombs on like different countries, etc.? And obviously not. But we can still recognize, right, that, you know, in this case, talking about the left more generally, that it's not, you know, it's not coincidence that a lot of the people who get this kind of hero status, or this kind of like daddy status of being the ones who have all the answers and, you know, whose books we should all read, etc. It's not coincidence that the majority of those are men. However, that does not mean that it's a good idea to like try and elevate women or put women on the same pedestal. Because one thing is that, you know, as noted over and over and over again, like a woman who gets put in that kind of, who gets that kind of special position, who gains that kind of status, that is, you know, definitely has some benefits to her, but it's not clear that it has any like strong influence or significance or benefits women in general. And even if, you know, there is some symbolic value to it, that is quite limited. And so it's like, if we're doing it, you know, putting all the effort into sort of elevating a few women, like for that relatively like minor purpose of having some sort of symbolic victory, we need to think about like what cost. On the one hand, in general, like, you know, how it takes away from doing other things, you know, it also like helps perpetuate this idea that we should think that certain people are special, which I don't, you know, like that certain people should be leading the rest of us, which I don't think is a good idea in general. And also, the people who make it to the top often have to, at the very least, step on a few toes to get there. And then there's another one in terms of course, is like the idea of the glass cliff, that a lot of women who get put like on pedestals or who get like high status positions often but basically being set up to fail, because it's not something that is like created with them in mind. It's a role that's very difficult to fulfill as a woman. Just again, bringing back to the ideas of what gives someone authority, being so tied up with masculinity, but obviously as a woman you can only, you know, perform masculinity to a certain degree before you get criticized for that too. And so it's just, it doesn't, as much as I have some sympathy for people who kind of have like a knee-jerk reaction that this is the right approach, I do ultimately agree with the criticism that it isn't correct. And I think this is a quote from Emergent Strategy. I don't think it's the author herself that has this quote, but I couldn't find it, so I don't know. But it's the idea that when forced into a binary, you always choose wrong. And I think here I think that kind of highlights what the problem with this sort of like girl boss approach is that, you know, you recognize that you're kind of being forced to follow along with people who have, you know, kind of authority or who gain leadership positions for the wrong reasons. And you are right to reject that. But if you kind of retain the binary, sort of the domination submission binary, then your assumption is, well, I don't want to submit to this person's will or this person's ideas because I think they're wrong. So I need to, like, you know, get into a position where I can make other people submit to like what I want to do. Because that is kind of the binary that's set up. But the important thing is to notice that, like, it's like heroes don't do us any good, even if they are women. And you as a woman are not really, I think, you know, doing anybody any favors by trying to like hold that kind of status within a group or like gain a leadership position in that way. So another thing that people do that irks me is when they sort of like do this thing in response to like, this was like in response to like the conservatives who were freaking out about Harry Styles wearing a dress. It was something that a lot of people were doing, where like they were like, well, real men would feel comfortable in a dress and real men like pink and, you know, all this kind of stuff. And it really annoys me when supposedly progressive or like radical people do this, because it's like, we shouldn't really be concerned with like what it means to be a real man. Like the whole conception of a real man is fake. We shouldn't be concerned with it in the first place. And so I think what we should do instead, because I feel like, I've done a lot of like critique or deconstruction in this talk, and I'm going to try to also offer some like improvements or things that I think are like good alternatives. And one thing I think is that I recognize that a lot of people do find the idea of like a masculine role model to be quite valuable, or like, talk a lot about, we know that like our ideas about masculinity are often, very like damaging and like come from these like patriarchal ideas about men's superiority. So it would be good to have like some positive masculine role models. And I think a good move is to then look to, I put female masculinity down here. I think, generally like queer masculinity is also something to take into account. But sort of just generally like, well, if you're looking for masculine role models, I do think that it's important to keep in mind that masculinity does not belong to men, and we should not act like it does. And I think that, sometimes people are like, well, we should have male role models too. It's like, well, sure, but then I think those male role models like kind of should earn that status, and to whatever degree you think role models is a legitimate concept. They should be the types of men who like are able to sort of take inspiration or guidance from masculine women and masculine people of other genders, because if you're the kind of man who feels like that is somehow lesser, then you probably shouldn't be anybody's masculine role model anyway. Another point I want to bring up is like the idea of our immediate community as a kind of front line or starting point. This is something that's brought up in emergent strategy, and I think it's generally been a major point in Black feminism, and it's definitely something that is being discussed quite a bit at the moment. And it's sort of like, I put down the quote here from Kimberly Nicole Foster, just a very basic idea. If we want different stuff, we go do different things. And so if we don't want the sort of perpetuation of like the daddy myth, as it were, well, then we have to stop acting like we believe in it, and we need to do what Adrienne Marie Brown calls science fictional behavior, which is basically the idea of like trying to imagine the future together, that we're in our communities, we need to try different things and try things that may not work. And that's why I put down like some three like ways of thinking about it she discusses in her book, which one is alignment, which is trying to figure out, well, if we don't agree with the current way of doing things, what do we want, what kind of things are we looking for, and try and find where like our interests and what we want aligns. And another thing is presence, which I think is quite interesting. It's like the idea that we talk a lot about preparing, as in like, I mean, just something like this conference, like you prepare a talk and stuff like that, but also in like political discussions. And she's very big on like the idea, well, the most important thing is that you're present for it, and that you're actually like present within the communities that you want to help, and that you should take inspiration from there, or you should take feedback from there as well if you're doing political work. And then the final bit is experimentation. So if we're doing things a certain way and it's not working, are we thinking we got to do different things?
I'm very sorry to interrupt, Emma, very quickly, but you've got 5 minutes left for your talk.
Yeah, I know. So what was I saying? Yes. So with the experimentation, it's like the acceptance of failure. Because we're going to try and do different things, and we, kind of venturing into uncharted territory, we've got to be very accepting of, experimentation going wrong, as it were, which I think is a huge step away from the sort of daddy figure who has all the answers and who can guide you and always, knows what to do. Like instead that we together need to kind of experiment and fail sometimes, and then take that into account, and then try and like realign and try again, and that is a good way to move forward. So that is sort of the end. I put down the end here because all my main points are done. But the one thing that I wanted to just make a quick note on is like what what I'm drawing upon for this talk. So one is a classic, The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. I think everyone probably has heard of this book. I just would like to note that it definitely holds up, is still very interesting, and I think she still has a lot of interesting insights. Another one is Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown, which talked a lot about. I think it's a really interesting book because it covers like so many different things and connects sort of general ideas about what it means to be human and what it means to, you know, want to organize with other people in the world, to things like facilitation strategies and general like worksheets that you can work through either communally or for yourself. And I think it's a really interesting book. And then also Female Masculinity by Jack Halberstam. If you find that under a different name, because he's changed his name, his first name, that's the same person, Female Masculinity. It's a great book, and I think gives a lot of insight into how to think about masculinity less like something that belongs to men and something that is more of a neutral term that has something to do with the things that men do, but also a lot of things has all to do with people of all kinds of genders and what they do and how they understand themselves. So that's a recommendation. And the final one is For Harriet, the YouTube channel, run by Kimberly Nicole Foster, which is dedicated primarily to applying Black feminist thought to pop culture. And I think it's a very, if you want to get into more Black feminism, I think it's an excellent starting point. One, because it's quite accessible, because it talks about things that you might already be familiar with, and secondly, because, you know, she does like mention a lot of thinkers and draws upon their ideas quite explicitly. So if you then kind of go from one of her videos where she talks about like different thinkers and then read more well, in your own time, I think you'll learn a lot. And so that is, you know, that is kind of the actual end. If you take anything away from this talk, is the idea that a great starting point for political work is, instead of trying to find one leader to follow or one man who's going to just give you all the answers, is to really take in the idea that no one is special and everyone is needed. And that's me actually done. Thank you.